Hello, I'm Donal McCauley and welcome to Medics Voices. Today I'm talking to Tom Dowd in Dublin. Tom is Emeritus Professor of General Practice in Trinity, but he's still working in general practice. Tom, let's take you back to the very beginning, because tell us, where did you grow up? Tell us about school and what brought you into medicine?
Well, I grew up in the west of Ireland in Roscommon, and we moved as a family from one part of rural Ireland to another. And that's a very big move because you leave your supports behind. So we were a family that relied on ourselves. And I think that has dictated a lot of my life, being an outsider and relying on our own resources. In the 1960s, the government changed policy on secondary school education, which provided free education to children who otherwise wouldn't have gone, and that included me. And then after that came opportunities to go to university. And so I'm a success of a government policy in that it allowed me to get a good education and then go on to university. The reason I did medicine, I was the first in my family to go to university. And I've said before, I counted 16 first cousins at one stage who had been to university subsequently. So it was something that was part of Ireland opening up at the time. But I was always interested in helping people. And that time in Ireland, when I was growing up, the church was a very prominent part of our lives. And many young men like myself who were getting an education were expected to go on and become priests. But there was only one problem for me. I would have quite liked to have been a priest, but I'd lost my belief. So I didn't think that being an unbelieving priest was the way to go. But I had that desire to, what I grandly called, help other people. And that at its simplest form has dictated my life, I think, that kind of urge to be useful. I've called it be useful. Nothing more grand than that.
So off you went to medical school. Tell us about medical school.
It was dreary. It was awful. And I thought of giving it up many times. I used to see, at that time there were Maoist groups. Mao Zedong was on the go, and I used to join Mao's groups to see if there was any excitement, and even they were dull because there wasn't that much establishment to be against, really. And it's funny that many years later, when I came back to Ireland in the 90s, I was asked to go on the medical council by Trinity, whom I was working for then. And eventually they insisted I go on, and I became chair of education. And it was a 5-year stint. And we reviewed medical education, which actually hadn't changed a whole pile from when I was a student in the 70s. And during that 5 years, we created a large number of changes, but it was driven really by my own poor experience as a medical student.
So then you went off and did GP training in Cork, and then, like many of a generation, you took the boat to cross the water.
I took the boat to Wales with my new wife and ended up in Cardiff on what would be called an overflow council estate. I'd little experience of that kind of urbanisation, and I fell on my feet with a wonderful group of people who were all salaried. Of course, Robert Harvard Davis was the professor at the time. And that was a very happy time for me and for the family. And of course, I also got involved. I went there because I intended to learn how to teach general practice. But I remember I got my first research grant, which was for £3,000 sterling. and I was able to do my MD on the back of that. And I quite liked research, and I liked the esteem that it gave me and the involvement with other people. I was in very early. Research wasn't as professionalized then as it is now, of course, but I did enjoy that. The teaching, I found, became a bit of a grind because the seminars were the same seminars 1 year after another, because you had to satisfy the curriculum. If one student got taught about breaking bad news, all 200 of them had to be taught about breaking bad news, and that became quite tiresome. And indeed, that's the way a lot of teaching remains. Teaching medical students, they all have to have the same thing, which is difficult. The clinical teaching, of course, in the practices was much more rewarding and interesting.
So then you went on to Nottingham and you continued your research career. Now, one of the things you researched was the heart sink patient.
Yes, I know.
How has that heart sink concept survived the decades of your professional life?
It has. It's entirely disrespectable, I suppose, in that at that time one could use the term, but I don't think you could get away with researching it now. So I'm delighted to say it's become part of the subculture, which is a much more interesting part of culture to be involved in. And it did touch I think the core of general practice. It gave GPs permission to say that this patient makes my heart sink, or this family makes my heart sink. And I mean, it's been researched by others, and it hasn't changed. I remember one old GP telling me that he had a cure for heart sink patients was that they moved, or the GP moved, or the GP died. So I thought they were fairly radical conclusions, but it was something that GPs, and of course younger GPs, I was a young GP when I described it, younger GPs experience it much more than older GPs who learn to, I suppose, the ebb and flow of practice.
Well, then you came back to Dublin, to Trinity, which was a fantastic step. And you had to follow in the footsteps of James McCormick and, of course, his sidekick, the inimitable Peter Skrabenik. That must have been one heck of a change.
It was, and I got to know James much better. I'd known James, I got to know James much better, and he became a much sought after speaker at meetings, and as he got older he became a better speaker, and of course he articulated views that challenged a lot of the I suppose dogmas that we all believe strongly in. And of course, when poor Peter got his final diagnosis, I looked after Peter, provided palliative care for him at home, which was a great honour, and got to know his family well. And again, I could relate to Peter very much because they were a very self-reliant family. When the tanks moved into Czechoslovakia, Peter and Vera were on holidays in West Cork, so they had nothing, and people rallied round them. He was received an updated medical education here in Dublin, and he remained grateful for that, but he was very much his own man, and right to the end. I remember giving him a medication to help his bone pain, and he asked me for the patient information leaflet so that he could read up the side effects. And of course I resisted any merry quips that about it making much difference at that stage, but he was a scientist to the end, really, even though he could be seen as perhaps anti-science, but he was a scientist to the end.
Well, Peter and James were pretty much pioneers, but in a sense you were a pioneer as well, because academic general practice was a bit of a desert at that stage.
Yes, it was. General practice, even though the Irish College of General Practitioners, the Royal College of General Practitioners were both present on the island. General practice, I always describe it as it was a cold house for general practice. Our colleagues, our specialist colleagues, expected very little of us. And the thing I found most difficult was to hear my much loved colleagues being patronised quietly and behind their backs. I found that very difficult. But we've stood at it. We've finally, I remember I set up a policy group to discuss the role of primary care as it was acceptable to the government. And it became evident to me that GPs didn't have the language of policy and didn't have the language of government. And they got very frustrated and would become short-tempered and would fulfill the preconceptions, well, you can't work with them anyway. And it was actually not having the language. And we now have that language and are much more successful as a result. We have learned the language of policy, we've learned the language of government, and we've been able to bring that innate listening to patients that we have to the table. What we were very short of was data about what went on in practice. I remember attending meetings and the professor of surgery or the professor of medicine or the professor of whatever would say they were able to how many patients they'd seen and how many of them were very ill and how many of them were quite ill and how many were waiting. Whereas we who were doing the bulk of the work had no data on that. Well, that has changed now. We now have information about how much work we do. COVID was, it sounds terrible to say it, but was a wonderful gift for general practice, because when it came down to it, we were in patient's corner. There was nobody else in the patient's corner. And it was almost like the best kept secret was out. And when it came to the diagnosis, when it came to the vaccinations, we were there. And of course, the Irish College of GPs realised that handling the media was very important, because the subspecialist voice on the media about COVID in particular was absolutely alarming and frightened people. Whereas the GPs like Mary Favier, whom you've interviewed, and Nuala O'Connor had that reassuring voice. Yes, this is the way things are, but if you do this, this and this, you have a better chance of avoiding it. And people couldn't get enough of that. It was during that period, general practice led the news cycle. Had never been heard of before. So we have availed of opportunities that are out there, and I think we're now there, which is a very enjoyable time for me to see that the profession it was almost like the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and we have very much become the cornerstone now of healthcare here.
Well, as part of becoming that cornerstone, I mean, you did your own part, because in your leadership roles you were on the medical council and you also were president of the ICGP. Tell us about those experiences.
Well, I was very reluctant to go on the medical council because it was so time consuming, and I was trying to build a department and one thing and another. But it turned out to be one of the high points of my career. I worked with Jerry Bury, who was my opposite number at the other university, UCD. And he was another driven character. And between the two of us, we influenced medical education, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. And that was a very important, it's led, for example, to the establishment of what we call the Fottrell Commission, which led to the establishment of the University of Limerick, which is a different style of medical education. So all those things came out of that 5-year period, which was a big achievement to bring a quite conservative country and a quite conservative profession into that area. Being president of the ICGP, I characterised myself as an E-president because it was largely during COVID. And I worked out a way of communicating with people through the College Journal Forum. And the editor, Niall Hunter, afforded me a regular slot. He would say, well, what is your view about this, that or the other? And one of the things I can do is write. So I was able to write and stay in touch. And of course, people read everything. I don't think they read anything I've written previously, but they read what I wrote during COVID. So it was, again, a great way of staying in touch with the profession and indeed with patients as well.
So now when you reflect back on your own individual achievements through your academic career, what are the things that stand out for you?
Well, I suppose my early days in research was I never expected to be a researcher. And they were very enjoyable. They were in-practice researchers. The large database research really didn't do it for me, even though I spent 10 years on a Growing Up in Ireland project. That didn't really do it for me. I suppose, and this will divide your audience, my time as a fund-holding GP was very formative. I think it brought out my inner barrow boy in that I can remember doing deals with ophthalmologists and people like that, orthopedic surgeons, to clear our waiting lists. And that has what I call social entrepreneurship, which I've been very much part of here, in that I have developed primary care centres. I've developed an academic primary care centre where I work in southwest Dublin, and with the private sector. I'm not, I don't mind who comes along as long as we can develop it. And that has been a hugely successful theme in my life. I suppose the medical council time, again, was a very successful time. And the fact that while I had a busy academic career, I was able to be a GP for a deprived population and get to know them and be respected by them and be accepted by them has been an achievement for me, which I value greatly.
Well, we've spoken about your academic and your political, I guess, in the widest sense, achievements. But you did something else which really struck a note with me in terms of the heritage of general practice through your photography project.
Oh, yes. That was very influenced by John Berger, that book, A Fortunate Man. And I had a sense at that time, that's about 10 years ago now, I had a sense at that time that general practice was changing and that we were moving very quickly from a single-handed, committed general practice into larger, more professionalized general practice, multi-partner, multi-doctor practice. And I engaged a photographer to go around with me practices, one actually on an island off the northwest coast of Ireland, one in County Clare, and an urban practice in County Cork and Mallow, and two practices here in Dublin. And we then had it as a public exhibition. Now, getting the ethics for all this was tricky, but anyway, we managed to do it and had a public exhibition called General Practice. And I used to go down there and stand in the exhibition centre where we had it. And it went on for 2 weeks, and there were always people in and out of it. And it was amazing to overhear the conversation saying, that's just like my GP. So it captured the authenticity of general practice. And it's gone round other centres in Ireland. People have wanted it to show it. And some of them are now on permanent exhibition in Trinity College and in the Irish College of General Practitioners. So it did capture that authenticity of general practice.
Now, you started off introducing you as the Emeritus Professor, which you retired from your academic post, but you're still in practice. Now, that's very different to many of the academics we meet who stopped their practice but continued their research work. You did it differently. Tell us about that experience.
Well, I'm now retired 9 years. I've just recently stepped down as a partner in the practice. And I suppose I still have the energy. I think a lot of it goes down to your biology. I've had my medical problems, of course, like every aged male, but I still have the energy and the interest to do it. And I just love the fact that the practice that I've seen grow and develop, the general practice in Ireland, is now a thriving, responsive, and indeed high-tech at times, because we have access to all the investigative modalities and also the drugs and medications that have come along and that I'm now able to provide for patients. I was very much involved in providing the policy document for the introduction of chronic disease monitoring in Ireland, which was taken up by the government, is now funded. And that again has to be evaluated, of course, but it's a hugely successful engagement with general practice. So I suppose I want to sit there and enjoy what's going on at the moment and marvel at it, really. I've got my colleagues in the practice who are 25 years younger than me, amazingly committed people who bought into the values of looking after a deprived population, looking after them well, worry about them, don't make judgments on them. All those things are very precious to me.
I heard you give a lovely introduction to the book of the history of Irish general practice. So my final question is, what's the future of Irish general practice?
Well, I think the future of general practice is always guarded. Having been around, watching the NHS after the Second World War, when general practice looked like it wasn't going to survive, and then seeing it prosper, and now seeing we keep a very close eye on NHS general practice, and now seeing it struggle while we're prospering. And it takes us to be vigilant. I think we have reached, I think, a good point at this stage, and we have to be vigilant. There are plenty of models out there of colleagues in some of the other specialties who have become complacent and have become avaricious, dare I say. I think we have to retain a humility that will shape our future. And I think our future will be shaped by, Bill Shannon used to say, walking with people in their times of difficulty. I think we need to remember that that's what we do, because we can, with the bigger practices, we can become remote. The idea of personal doctoring, that we've had a very strong tradition of personal doctoring here in Ireland, that I think may suffer. And there are segments of the population who consult perhaps online, consult doctors who are providing niche primary care, but the kind of bread and butter general practice has got to be, we've got to be always vigilant about it. And of course, we have to sort out how we have that personal care. I think that's a big challenge for us as we get bigger, and because people do want to come into a doctor that knows them, but more importantly, they want to come into a doctor that they know.
Doctor that they know and a doctor that knows them. What a lovely end of the conversation. Tom Dowd, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me too. Thank you, Donald.